Good afternoon. I'm Dennis Galucki. Welcome to the 583rd Imagine Greater Buffalo program and our 204th YouTube production, hosted by our cultural treasure, the downtown Buffalo and Erie County Public Library. Profoundly public library, I might add. Thanks for joining us today. This program is created by the Center for the Study of Art, Architecture, History, and Nature, or C-SAAHN, as I like to pronounce the acronym, and ImagineLifelongLearning.com. Now, before we get started, just a little housekeeping. Everyone watching will be muted and your video turned off. If you have a question or comment, please type it into the chat box and we'll go through them at the end of the presentation as time allows. We are recording this program so you can watch it again later on the Central Library's Facebook page and YouTube channel. And please, we hope you share the link with others. Now, on to our featured speakers. We were hoping to have Paris Roselli today, but along with Patrick Ryan, but Patrick is going to carry the load here, and a good man to do so. Patrick is the cultural curator of the Richardson Olmsted Campus and Lipsey Architecture Center, Buffalo. So welcome, Patrick. Why don't you get us started? Tell us a little background. How did you get to this wonderful position that you have? Patrick, take it away.
Sure. Thank you, Dennis, of course, for having us today. Excited to spread a little bit of knowledge on the site and kind of what's coming up. So as Dennis said, my name is Patrick Ryan. I'm the cultural curator down here at the Richardson. I took a pretty traditional route, I would say, into history. So I went to Buff State, actually. So right around the corner, I got my MA in history there back in 2018. And from there, I started over at the History Museum for about 5 years as their program volunteer and education coordinator, and decided about 2.5 years ago to slide on down Elmwood to the Richardson Olmsted Campus. So I've been in about 1 square quarter mile for about 10 years. So pretty familiar with the cultural corridor here in Buffalo. But so I've been at the Richardson for about 3 years. Some of my work outside of the campus. I'm also an adjunct professor down at Hilbert College for African American Studies, and I do some work for Ashland, the Henry Clay Estate down in Lexington, Kentucky. So pretty wide range, I guess. But that's a little bit about me and kind of my background here in history. And if we're good to get going, Dennis, I can start on a little bit of the history of the site itself. I figured today we can look at what this building was, if you're not super familiar with it, and then transition into some of our upcoming plans, like the Lipsey Architecture Center, Buffalo. So here, let me just share my screen here. And get started. So like I said, if you're not familiar with us, we're the Richardson Olmsted Campus, formerly the Buffalo State Asylum for the Insane, and we're located right on 444 Forest Avenue. So we are the big building right behind Buffalo State there at Forest and Elmwood. And who are we exactly? So I'm representing 2 nonprofits today. The first is the RCC Richardson Center Corporation. That's the nonprofit that has acted as a steward of all 45 acres and 500,000 indoor square feet since about 2006. That's the nonprofit that is tasked with preserving buildings, rehabilitating them, and operating the hotel out of the 3 center buildings. The second is the Lipsey Architecture Center, Buffalo. We'll be talking about that a little bit more later, but that handles all of the education, tours, and exhibit space on campus as well. So I'm kind of wearing 2 hats here today. Here are some older photos of the facility back from really probably its height, the late 1800s, early 1900s. So a little bit about how we sort of got this facility and sort of the background behind it. So really up until the 18th century, mental health as a field wasn't really practiced in the most benevolent terms. And really for the first time in the late 1700s, 2 gentlemen, one from England, one from France, William Tuke and Philippe Pinel, they essentially start the first look at mental health care through the benevolent lens. And they come up with something Pinel specifically called moral treatment, where if you treated patients with dignity and respect, focusing on things like fresh air, sunlight, and exercise. Basically, if you could make the physical body feel better, the mind would follow. And it's sort of from this point as you enter into the 1800s that the United States, namely Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride, as we'll find out in a little bit, start to adopt this idea of moral treatment and applying it on a much wider scale. So why does Buffalo end up getting this facility? Well, as you get into the 1860s, right, it's post-Civil War now. 600,000 Americans died during that conflict, and there's sort of a new renewed focus placed on mental health care. And at this time, New York State leaders, they realized that the closest mental health facility that services the western portion of the state is all the way in Utica. So pre-automobile, sure, there were railways, but if you sent a family member all the way out to Utica, good chance that you probably weren't ever going to see them again. And if you did, it would be pretty sporadic. So essentially, a bunch of towns in Western New York, they throw their name into the hat to hopefully be the site of a new state-of-the-art gold standard mental care facility. Lockport, Warsaw, Batavia, Westfield, Mayville, and Buffalo, they are all considered to become the location of this new facility. And Buffalo, at this point, as you're into the 1860s, by the time you reach 1900, Buffalo is one of the top 10 largest cities by population in the States. We have the most millionaires per capita right here in our city. And this is where you see the birth of all of our art galleries, history museums, businessmen and local millionaires hiring some of the best architects from around the country to design their houses. And really, a facility like this was going to be another kind of feather in the cap for this growing soon to be even more important city. And the two reasons why Buffalo gets chosen, one, they set aside 203 acres of green space for the asylum to be placed on. So originally our campus included all of Buffalo State. So if you think about it, you're pretty much from the Church of the Assumption over on Amherst to Reese Street to Forest to Elmwood. So kind of that parcel right there, if you can visualize that with me. So they set aside this land, and it's an area where, as we'll find out, you can engage in things like agricultural therapy, but you're close enough to a growing, large, pretty wealthy city where if you needed things like workforce, supplies, floating things like Medina sandstone down the Erie Canal, it was all pretty reachable. The second thing was at the northern edge of our property runs Scajaquota Creek. The city of Buffalo offered the asylum 100 years of free fresh water to use. And really, once Buffalo's chosen in 1869, there's three gentlemen that come together to make it possible. The first was technically never here, and that's Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride. He's born in Pennsylvania of Quaker background. If you're familiar with Quakers, they're usually pretty progressive, and that was also applied to medicine. And he was actually trained as a general surgeon, but in his early 30s, he's given the opportunity to become the superintendent of the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane. He realizes this is a pretty good chance for a young physician, and he takes it. And pretty much from there on, he becomes the leading voice on mental health care in the States for the next about 50 years or so. And really kind of his main thing that he comes up with in 1854, he writes on the general construction, organization, and treatment of the mentally ill, which gets shortened to the Kirkbride Plan. And it's in the Kirkbride Plan that he details both the physical building that he wants to see, as well as the actual treatment. It's considered the first scientific architectural response to mental health care in the States. And as far as the physical buildings went, they all follow kind of the same pattern. Maybe you can see my mouse here, but you would have one central administration building. In our case, the Towers building, that's where physicians and their families actually lived year-round on the upper floors. On either side, you would have 5 wards separated by the sexes. In our case, women on the west side, men on the eastern side. And that actually also applied to staff as well. So if you were on the eastern side with the men, that meant male doctors, male nurses, male cooks, male maintenance, all the way down the line. As far as designations, the most unstable patients would be in the outermost wards. As they progress through their treatment, they would literally progress down the line until they could hopefully walk right out the front door. Kirkbride hospitals, there's about 85 built throughout the States during this period. There's only about 12 left today, but they were categorized by super large corridors, a ton of focus on fresh air and sunlight, large day rooms, and sort of this agricultural and pastoric sort of look at mental health care. So all of these hospitals were operated by one superintendent. They needed a minimum of 100 acres, and originally they were built to house around 300 patients. But as we'll see, that changes in Buffalo. Basically, they realize that we're a growing city, and they increase that number to about 660 patients. As far as the treatment went, he plugs right into that Pinnell gentleman that we discussed earlier, into moral treatment, where sunlight, fresh air, calisthenics, and exercise were super important. Again, if you could make the physical body feel better, their mind would follow. So in our old photos, you see everything from baseball to hiking. There was a sport fishing pond on site, all sort of outdoor activities for patients to engage in, with kind of the main piece being that 100+ acre working farm where Buff State is located today. And Kirkbride himself, and here are some pictures that we can look at while I talk. This is on the South Lawn. They would do things like fairs and, like I said, some exercise things here. But Kirkbride, he was more so focused on treating those with acute issues. He viewed his facilities as more so retreats, focused on people that were suffering from things like death of a family member, veterans from the Civil War, things like that. Basically, he saw if patients could come here for a year to 2 years, perhaps in this retreat style setting, engage in these sort of nature-based therapies, that they would hopefully be reformed and on their way. He wasn't as focused on those with super chronic issues. The second person that becomes involved is Frederick Olmsted, right? His name is on the building. He had already designed the Buffalo Park system up to this point. And basically, he is called back. The city leaders say, hey, now we have, well, probably actually was written a letter, but that's all right. He was brought back to design the 203-acre parcel. And it's there that he comes up with the swales, the pathways, plants 250 trees, 2,000 native shrubs, all to create this sort of naturalized landscape. And actually, upon his recommendation, here, I'll backtrack just a little bit. You can kind of see it here. If you look at our building from overhead, you see that it's not flush with Forest Ave. It's actually slightly tilted. He recommended this to increase sunlight every day. And 2, if you look at Buffalo, you see that we have these rounded connectors that cause the building to be set in this sort of flying V shape. Up to this point, all Kirkbrides were built in a straight line, also known as the linear plan. But Olmsted, and he was correct, believed that if you stacked the wards back, it would increase the natural airflow that pumped through the wards from day to day. So Olmsted not only affects the actual grounds, but the building itself too. And then the third person is, of course, H.H. Richardson. He was born in Louisiana. He's the first American architect to be trained overseas at the School of Fine Arts in Paris. It's there that he's pretty obviously, I would say, inspired by sort of that Romanesque and Gothic cathedral architecture around him in the city. And he comes back to the States. And at this point, he is also in his early 30s, kind of like Kirkbride was when he came up with his Kirkbride plan. And he's relatively untested. But he has 2 really nice routes into the project. One, he is neighbors with Frederick Olmsted on Staten Island, and their offices are pretty much next to each other on Broadway in New York City. And 2, he had already built 1 building in Buffalo to this point, designed, and that was the William Dorshimer Mansion, which still stands at 434 Delaware today. And coincidentally, Dorshimer was on the board to bring an asylum to Buffalo. So basically, Dorshimer and Olmsted, they vouch for him. They bring him onto the project in 1870, and he designs what goes on to become the largest commission of his career at about 600,000 indoor square feet when it was built. And it's really the first time that you see his signature style Richardsonian Romanesque really take shape. So construction begins in 1871. The cornerstones laid in 72. Like I said, they kind of saw the population of Buffalo and realized they needed to increase that 300 bed number to about 650. And in 1880, the asylum opens for the first time. However, only the eastern side was completed up until this point. Essentially, with changing legislation and governors in New York, people are starting to question dedicating all of these funds to this giant, monolithic, expensive structure. This cost about $300 million in today's money to construct, and sort of the construction is put on hold for about 10 years. Unfortunately for Richardson, he never gets to see his project finished. He passes away in 1886, and other local architects like E.B. Green, who has the Albright Knox and the Gold Savings Bank downtown, and William Wicks step in to finish the project. From there on, in 1890, New York State grants the rest of the funding to finish the facility, and it's all the way in 1895 that the building is finally finished. However, there is one kind of major caveat that happens during that time. Basically, in 1890, New York State, they said, we will give you the funding to finish the building in exchange for you transitioning from a private facility to a public one. So as much as the architecture and the grounds and sort of this artistic curation was part of the healing process, it was also to attract middle and upper class families that could afford to send their family here. When the facility becomes public, however, the homeless, the more chronically ill, whose illnesses can't really be solved by fresh air and sunlight in many cases, are essentially rounded up and dropped off here. So by the time you get into the 1900s, a facility built for about 650, you have almost 4,000 people living inside. So it does signal a pretty sharp decline. But types of patients wise, there were four main types. You would have the chronic, the acute, the convalescent, and those with contagious diseases. And back then, they weren't as specific with mental health designations, and they were more or less categorized into four main groups: mania, melancholia, dementia, and monomania. Patient rooms were 9 by 11 feet with vaulted ceilings and large windows, relatively small, but they really served just as your bunking area. If you weren't sleeping, you were expected to be out on the South Lawn in Andrews Hall, which was built in 1905 as an entertainment space, out on the baseball diamond, or the reason for small rooms and extra large corridors and day rooms, socialization with other patients or caretakers on their ward floor. Here are some pictures of what a ward floor would have looked like. This is probably about turn of the century, 1900, probably about 1920 if I had to guess, just looking at it. Here's one of the dining rooms as well, where patients would eat. Again, for its kind of upscale nature, pre-overcrowding, white tablecloth dinners at the end of every hallway, every day, imported English china. It truly was a very upscale facility. And a few more shots here. And here are some pictures of the working farm. You can see the Church of the Assumption right here. So that's a good sort of wayfinding mark on both of these pictures to kind of grasp how large this area of land was. All right. And as you enter the 1900s, you have way more patients than you thought. The building with brick and mortar is already starting to, degrade a little bit. And the state isn't super keen on continuing to fix it or continuing to add more structures to this monolithic building. So there's a full shift from what is called asylum style care to cottage style. If you needed, say, a tuberculosis ward, a surgery building, a nurse's station, it's way cheaper to just pop it up out of timber somewhere on the lawn on this 203 acres than it is to get Medina sandstone and keep adding to the original building. So by the time you get into the 1930s or so, there's about 35 additional buildings on site that all do vastly different things, from, like I said, TB wards to a fully functioning general hospital called the Elmwood Hospital, kind of like where the Birchfield Penny is. As you enter into the 30s as well, you'll see a shift, kind of that focus on fresh air and sunlight starts to get replaced with more alternative therapies, things like malaria therapy, electroshock, hydrotherapy, and eventually the introduction of pharmaceutical drugs, really at a wide scale in the 1950s. So like I said, as you get into the 30s, it really marks that sharp decline. Built for 650 has almost 4,000. There are changes in the care being given. In 1927, for example, the question of, is agricultural therapy truly for the benefit of the patients, or is it in a way exploiting free labor as they grow all of their own food? So in 1927, about 150 acres or so is ceded over to Buffalo State to become their permanent home. About 10 years later, the 9-acre South Lawn, which used to be a recreation pasture for patients, is paved over to make a parking lot. So you start to see a lot of changes to the physical building and sort of the treatment style as you enter this period. And by the time you get into the late 50s, they realize that they need a more modern replacement. And in 1964, they build the Strozzi building, just about a stone's throw from the original entrance right here, as you see in this photo up here. For the last 10 years that this facility, the one that I'm in, the original Richardson, is operating, most of the mentally ill patients had already been moved across the street. and it really serviced sort of as Kirkbride's worst nightmare, more so a human warehouse than an area of treatment. In 1974, though, the last patients altogether come out of the historic wards, and the complex is added to the National Historic Registry in 1973. Essentially, from then on, New York State puts a fence around the building, locks the doors, turns off the heat, and says, you know what, good luck to the city of Buffalo. The building was always in danger of being torn down, however expensive that process might be. But in 1986, it received the highest federal honor as a National Historic Landmark, affording it some protection for the next few years. The majority of the facility is abandoned from anywhere from 30 to 40 years. As we know with Buffalo winters and brick and mortar, you get water in there, it expands to ice. The place was really probably going to collapse, as many of the other buildings on site already had by the time you reach the 2000s. And here are some interior photos of how things look today. So it needs a little bit of work. So this building sits here, and something that really was supposed to be a gold star for the city of Buffalo becomes the exact opposite, right? This was something that the local community was supposed to be proud of, but when a building that looks like this sits abandoned for as long as it does, and no one's talking about the real history, it almost becomes a blight on the surrounding community. It's also landlocking the west side, Elmwood Village, and North Buffalo from each other, right? This was originally an Olmsted landscape, and they put up a giant fence around it. But all the way about 30 or so years after its original closure, in 2006, the nonprofit I work for, the RCC, they actually sued the state of New York, where they were awarded the property, all 45 acres and all the buildings, as well as a nice stipend to start the first round of renovations. And as any good nonprofit or museum has, we have a master plan, quote unquote. The first sort of step on that plan was the restoration of that 9-acre south lawn, which was paved over to create a parking lot in the 1930s. That was finished in the early 2010s, and now that area serves as both a public park, so people, walk their dogs, play football out there, do whatever, as well as, I would say, probably our main public programming area. We do everything from skiing in the winter to holiday markets in the fall. I'll plug it later, but this Sunday we're actually doing a Bills game out on the lawn, 2 screens, a whole lot of kids' activities. So a real way to sort of give this whole space back to the community it was intended for. Number 2 on that master plan was taking the 3 center buildings and creating something economically viable. Ooh, we go back one. And that was a hotel. This was a difficult building to reuse, as it was a machine built for mental health, right? Small rooms, extra large hallways. It was sort of tough to figure out what to do, but a hotel was opened in 2017 and still exists today as the Richardson Hotel. And here are some of the events that we've done the last couple of years. Like I said, everything from Learn to Ski to the Eclipse over Elmwood to more academic style programs like book reviews and academic lectures. And now to a little bit about what the LACB does. It's the other nonprofit on campus, and like I said, it handles all of the education. That includes tours. We do vacant section tours every Saturday and Sunday with hard hats, where you get 2 hours to sort of explore the grounds, walking tours that highlight the Olmsted campus with our horticulturists, photography tours, and of course, exhibit space. Right now, in the bottom portion of the Towers building exists the LACB Gallery. One side focuses on general Buffalo architecture, but the other side more closely detailing the campus history. But I can say this small gallery is really 0.001 of what's to come. We have plans to take Building 12, which was the old men's kitchen, put an addition on there that is designed by Boston firm Howler and Yoon, and do a 13 exhibit architecture center right on site, highlighting Buffalo's rich architectural collection, right? We probably have the second best in the country. We're the only other city outside of Chicago to have Richardson, Wright, and Sullivan within city limits. And we're also the only and we're also home to America's first female architect, Louise Blanchard Bethune. And the Martin House touches on their thing, the History Museum does their thing, but there's really no central location for Buffalo architecture as you see in some other larger cities. So the idea is people will come here. We've identified about 120 buildings or so that we consider architecturally contributing. They get to learn about them, and then everyone will leave with a self-curated tour to then go out to these sites, visit them, learn about them, and of course, spend their money at those sites as well. And here is a rendering of what we have planned. So you see the original building 12 here with this sort of scalloped glass addition to the northern side. And just for context, this is on the Buffalo State side of campus. Like I said, it's going to be 13 exhibits, everything from learning about buildings that no longer exist here to theater rooms talking generally about the history of Buffalo all the way down the line. So the last thing I'll plug before I believe we have a Q&A here is this Sunday. Like I said, we are hosting a community watch party on site. That's going to be everything from local Buffalo Bills vendors, so you know your vintage stuff, to food trucks, to a touch truck. The fire department will be here, bounce houses, all sorts of kids activities, and 2 screens out on the south lawn. So if you can make it, come on back to your Olmsted landscape. So with that, my very brief overview of about 130 years of history, I can open it up to a Q&A if anybody had anything.
It went by quickly. We don't have a lot of time, but let's just start it off, see if there are any questions that have come in. Hazen, do we have any?
I do not have any questions that I've received.
Good. Then I'll ask you, you just hosted a major national conference, as I recall, that's pointing the way to the importance of what you're doing and going forward, how it'll be viewed by the rest of the country, I would think. How did it go?
It went really well. So yeah, Dennis is referring to let's see, this was all the way, was this in May or June? Time's flying, but we hosted the Society for Industrial Archaeology, which is a national group. They've been around quite a long time, and every year they pick a new city to basically be the site of their conference. Buffalo last had it, I believe, all the way back in the 1990s. And basically the LACB, our Future Architecture Center, decided to essentially invite them to Buffalo. And as we are constructing this center, be that co-location center for Buffalo's architecture. So we had about 140 historians, architects, and architectural aficionados visit the city, stay here for about 3 or 4 days, and visit sites all over the city, everything from the Richardson to Colonel Ward Pumping Station to some of the power plants like the Tesla plants. Pretty wide range of touring for 4 days.
Great. I'm glad it went well, and it bodes well for future times here for Buffalo to boast and show the nation, for you folks to help show the nation the architecture that is unique, as you pointed out, second perhaps to Chicago in terms of both the tours that are given here through Explore Buffalo. We use Chicago as a model to help design those tours originally with Buffalo Tours. And,
exactly.
And your good efforts and that new building. What's your completion date, by the way, for the new building?
So I'll keep it loose because, as we know, construction can, kind of float here and there. But we're hoping for end of 26.
End of 26.
That's the plan. Yeah.
Wouldn't that be nice? All right.
That would be. We'll see. But that's the goal.
It's been there for quite a while. Buffalonians have looked at the space. You've done a great job of helping us understand what was there that shaped the very buildings that we were looking at. But what's going to be there is what's going to be exciting as well. So thank you very much, Patrick. Well done. Well done. Folks, thank you again for joining us today. We hope you'll come back next week, Tuesday, September 16th on Zoom, where we will be joined by Susan Buttaccio. Now, Susan is the manager of the Special Collections Department at the downtown Buffalo and Erie County Public Library. And her discussion will be profoundly public happenings in the Grosvenor Room of the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library. You're going to want to see that. It'll bring history right up to date with what's going on, looking back at how that room got created. I'm Dennis Galucki. Be well and have a good day.